Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're safe and certainly healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of virtual conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Our last session, which took place on the afternoon of the first president, asked a very simple question: would foreign policy figure prominently at all in the election? And our three panelists, Charlie Cook, Jen Psaki, and Amanda Carpenter, I think myself included, knew the answer to that question before we began. Not so today. The question we pose, will American democracy survive November 3rd and beyond, is unanswerable. It may be overly dramatically rendered, but there are simply too many unknowns and too many uncertainties and fears about the consequences of this election. There are also hopes. Rachel Kleinfeld has written, and I would put myself in agreement that with this, reflecting the fact that for many, it's hard to imagine that the U.S. won't find a way to muddle through. Ross Douthat argued in the New York Times on Sunday that we will definitely muddle through and then some. Let me just quote what he said. Meanwhile, the scenarios that have been spun out in reputable publications where Trump induces Republican state legislatures to overrule the clear outcome in their states, or militia violence intimidates the Supreme Court into vacating a Biden victory, bear no relationship to the Trump presidency we've actually experienced. Our weak, ranting, infected by COVID chief executive is not plotting a coup, because a term like plotting implies capabilities that he conspicuously lacks. Maybe, but our conviction, I would argue, and faith that the American story and the American democracy will somehow magically and inexorably triumph, and that everything is going to turn out to be okay, cannot and should not and never should be taken for granted. The founders didn't do it, take it for granted, and neither did some of our greatest presidents and leaders. Rarely has this republic been more at sea, and few elections have taken place amidst a sense of greater crisis and uncertainty, not to mention the problem of mail-in ballots, which will constitute a huge percentage of the votes counted. I would count at least 5 crises interlocked: a pandemic, the worst threat to global health since the great influenza of 1918, an economic recession, which has many economists scratching their heads with respect to structural problems and challenges in the economy, polarization and civil unrest driven by racial, class, political divisions, a loss of confidence in our institutions, from the post office to the census, and a president, the first in American history, who has already said repeatedly and publicly that he will not abide by the results of the election. As Barton Gellman has noted, Trump may win or lose, but he will never concede. And concession is more than just a ritualistic, formulaic speech. It's a symbol that legitimizes the peaceful transfer of power in our electoral system. So how bad could it get? Are any of the nightmare scenarios associated with contestation really likely? What are the core challenges to the election? And do we have the institutional guardrails, Congress, the courts, the Constitution, to keep us on track? And as Rachel has pointed out, how do we even begin to repair our broken political culture and social and political contract? And perhaps most important, I think, as Michael Steele has noted, quoting Martin Luther King, quote, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter." So what can we do about all this? This challenge, this threat, before it materializes, and if and when it does. Fortunately, all is not lost. We have 3 extraordinary presenters to lead us out of the wilderness, or at least to guide us and ask the kinds of questions that we need to ask and create some reality-based answers. They're known to all of you. I'll skip their resumes, but only say Michael Steele is the former Lieutenant Governor of the state of Maryland and Senior Advisor to the Lincoln Project. Bart Gellman is a staff writer at The Atlantic. You've all seen his recent article. And the author most recently of Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State, as well as the best-selling Angler, the Cheney vice presidency. And, of course, Carnegie's own Rachel Kleinfeld, senior fellow, where she focuses, and I might add, excels in an extraordinary fashion in writing and speaking on issues from the rule of law to security to governance post-conflict in post-conflict countries, fragile states, and those in transition. So the drill is pretty simple. Each will present for 5 minutes or so, beginning with Michael. We'll go to a moderated round of questions and then Q&A from the audience. Let me just say, as far as the Q&A is concerned, I will read the instruction. We will have a live Q&A session where you can ask us questions. To ask a question, use the live chat feature in YouTube. Email us at pressoffice@ceip.org or tweet at us at Carnegie and Dow using the hashtag Carnegie Connects. So, I've droned on for too long. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you.
No problem. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. It's great to be here, and it's particularly fun to be on a panel with Rachel, whom I've got to know and work with over the past year or so, and just I agree with everything you said. Just an incredible, insightful talent. And Mr. Bart, great to be with you, buddy. Appreciate the work you're doing over at The Atlantic. And so let's get right into the question, because I think it's an important one. Will democracy survive November 3rd? The short answer is yeah, it will. It may look a little different, but it will. It's kind of ironic that I've got some of my Republican friends, like Senator Mike Lee, saying that we're not a democracy, and that's not the most important thing now. Let's set that crazy aside. But the fact of the matter is, it really goes to the heart of the answer to the point. It survives if you want it to. It survives if we, the people, want it to. And that quote from Dr. King, which for me is so salient and important right now, that we really become our own end when we sort of turn our blind eye to things that matter. We end this democracy. We end this grand American experiment when we decide no longer to care about the things that matter. So, folks, what matters to you? This election matters to a lot of Americans. The outcome of this election matters to a lot of Americans. But even more important than that is the various institutions that have safeguarded our rights and our liberties, from our courts to our legislative branches, to our executive leaders, from president to county executives. They all have played a role in securing the promise that's laid out in our founding documents. While the execution of those ideas and ideals have been flawed and problematic over the years, the underlying words still matter. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. It didn't say to form a perfect union or to say that we were. We are constantly striving in this republic to create a democracy, to create a voice, and to give power to people. So when I look at this election, that is paramount for me. It is why I stand in opposition to my own party, because I feel that they've walked away from those ideas and those values for the musings and the rantings of one man. George Washington proved that this country was not just about one person. It was not about one individual. Donald Trump, unfortunately, is trying to prove him wrong. And I have faith in reliance in the American people when they look at this and they see where we are and what this means to them and their families, but more importantly, to the future of this country, that they will step into the power that is granted to them in those founding words, we the people. The core challenges that we face right now to having a legitimate election is how we shore up those institutions. So the writings of individuals like Bart and the work of individuals like Rachel and a lot of smart people across this country matters now more than ever before. Their ability to coalesce and condense ideas and facts and information to inform the citizenry, not just about what's at stake, but the underlying truths that support what's at stake, that supports an open, free, fair election, where we see litigation now in places like Texas, where the governor said, well, we only want one drop-off box in a county of 5 million people. Okay, let that sink in. Now, they will say, oh, no, that's not voter suppression at all. 5 million people going to one location to drop off their ballot. Yeah, that's voter suppression. So being informed and engaged and understanding what the thing is you're seeing and hearing matters at these times, and why conversation like this with people way smarter than me. I'm just a political guy. I'm just a guy, I happen to get elected. I know a little bit about that and politics, but I rely on my secretaries of states and people who have studied this, the political scientists, the lawyers, and the folks who kind of deal with the machinations of these things from a legal as well as a societal standpoint, so that we all understand exactly what's at stake. The prospects of what happens over the next few weeks leading up to the election, is certainly in the interregnum between the election and the inauguration itself, does matter. So as I've said repeatedly, on election night, folks, just get a tall glass of your favorite adult beverage, sit back, and watch the process unfold. Stay calm, and the reason I can be calm is because of the hard work and information that's being put out front to sort of help me understand exactly what to expect on the back end. Yes, we have a president who's saying he wants his supporters to go be poll watchers. Well, let's be clear about that. They just can't show up and be poll watchers. Being a poll watcher is a specific regulated position in every county in this country. You have the county parties and the state parties have to identify ahead of time who those poll watchers are. So I just can't show up in my neighborhood poll and start injecting myself into that process. So understanding what can be done, what can't be done, the consequences of violations that may occur does matter. And that's why conversations like this are so important. And I'm so glad to be a part of them. So I'll turn it over now so smarter people can lay down some smarter tracks.
Michael, I must say your reputation has preceded you, and you've given us all, I think, me for sure, a boost of enthusiasm and hope. And I wouldn't rule out, by the way, the role of pols and politicians, because the problem you describe is not, it's necessary. Bart and Rachel are critically important. It's necessary to the repair of what ails us, but it's clearly not sufficient. Committed individuals like you involved in the public conversation and the political process, that's also going to be extremely important. But thanks again. Barton Gellman, over to you.
Well, I find Michael reassuring, and because it's sort of voice of experience plus someone paying very, very close attention to what's happening now and can look at things with a bit of perspective. I am nonetheless somewhat more concerned, I think, about the prospects for a normal election, or for getting through it intact at the far end. This is not going to be a normal election. We're already past that. There's no chance of it. We have a president who has worked hard to delegitimate the vote count, to tell people in advance that they cannot trust that the vote count will be accurate. There is almost nothing that could undermine the electoral process more than that, than to have an authority figure telling you that the one mechanism we have for deciding who rules us, who we the people are delegating our political power to, is broken, is filled with fraud, is rigged. Now, Trump has said explicitly and not off the cuff, but in his prepared remarks, as he accepted the Republican nomination for president on August 24th, he said, the only way that we can lose this election is if the vote is rigged. So he has already ruled out the possibility that we, the people, democratically, by our own accurate volition, are going to remove him from power. I mean, in any other country, if the ruler said that, we would be very concerned. He also has given several versions, which we've all heard, of a refusal to guarantee that he would honor the results of the election and enable a peaceful transfer of power. The one that was most alarming to me is the one, and you always have to be careful about imposing too much coherence on the sort of word salad that comes out of his mouth. But I thought the message was fairly clear. He said, in answer to the question about peaceful transfer of power, well, as you know, we have a very big problem with the ballots and with ballot fraud, and I think he meant the mail-in ballots. He said, if you fix that, then there'll be a peaceful, and then he switched directions in his sentence. He said, there won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. He is saying that if the counting goes the only way he thinks is acceptable, then he's reelected. So I think we can safely say, based on his record and based on his actual words, that under no circumstances, literally, will Trump concede defeat in this election. And that turns out to be a very big deal because concession is the way we have ended elections in this country for well over 100 years. It's the moment of concession that tells you the fight is over, and that, as the political scientists would say, is constitutive of the authority of the incoming president. It is that more than any other single fact about the election, because we have no umpire. This is a game in which we don't have someone who keeps track of the score, keeps track of the time, blows the whistle and says, okay, well, you won and you lost. And it doesn't matter how much the players or the coaches bellyache about it. That's the result. It's over. And everyone understands that a decisive result has been achieved. People sometimes talk about the risk with Trump, or the concern, even though it sounds fantastical, is that he might lose the election and refuse to leave. And in fact, our system does know very well how to respond to that. He would be escorted out. And he would have some help with his luggage, and the Oval Office would be ready for the next occupant. That's not the concern. The concern is that Trump could use the power of his office and the power of his control over his followers to prevent a decisive result from being obtained, to prevent a decisive result against him. If he is, we have never had a president who has said amid the count that there is fraud happening, the vote is being rigged before our eyes. And it is unclear how we'll respond to that, especially if he uses the power of his office to give an alternative official point of view, not just his Twitter account, not just the words that come out when he faces a microphone, but actions of the government itself. Suppose that the Justice Department announces a fraud in progress and an immediate investigation as the vote is being counted. Suppose votes are impounded as evidence. Suppose the postal inspectors find irregularities with the mail vote and suspend delivery of mail ballots, or decide to reprocess everything to make sure that a valid postmark has been applied. It's actually not the case that the Postal Service requires by regulation that a postmark be stamped on every letter. Sometimes they're not. But election laws in some states require a postmark for mail-in ballots. So suppose the postal inspectors say, well, let's make sure we reprocess all these and that there's a valid and legible postmark to comply with electoral law. And by doing so, takes things past the deadline. Trump has actual government power under color of law that could be abused and might even be found to be unlawful eventually after the fact. But we don't get do-overs in the elections, and after the fact isn't good enough. There's also what happens on election day itself. This is the first election in 40 years that is taking place without the oversight of a federal court over Republican quote-unquote ballot security measures, which is another word for voter suppression. There is a pretext of guarding against voter fraud. Voter fraud is almost entirely a fictional concept. It is vanishingly rare. There was a good study done of 1 billion votes cast between 2000 and 2014, of which 31 were identified as fraudulent. 31 out of 1 billion. This is the scale of the problem, if you could call it a problem. It certainly has no prospect whatsoever of affecting the results of an election. But on the grounds of voter fraud, on grounds of this pretext, Republicans used to do things like they would have off-duty police and sheriffs and former military folks and large, scary people carrying guns, wearing armbands, confronting voters, demanding to review their credentials to vote, warning them that it's a felony to vote if you're not eligible or if you're in the wrong precinct, putting up big signs, generally intimidating people of color in minority neighborhoods. And Trump has, for example, called out Philadelphia, which happens to be a large Democratic stronghold in an essential swing state that he must win to be president. And he may be behind in the polls in Pennsylvania, but if he can shave a couple of points off by intimidating voters on the day of and by causing mail-in votes not to be counted, then who knows where that goes. And then there is what Michael mentioned, which is the whole interregnum between Election Day and the swearing in of the new president. There are milestones in that process that actually decide who the president is going to be. Ordinarily, they are mere formalities, and even a well-informed voter would be forgiven for not knowing that December 14th is a very big day. That's when the Electoral College meets and actually casts its ballots, or that January 6th is a very big day, which is when Congress formally counts the votes that have been cast by the Electoral College. And there are many opportunities, as I described in my piece for The Atlantic, for a candidate who has influence over fellow members of his party to interfere with the normal functioning of the Electoral College or the normal functioning of the count. And I think if you take Trump seriously as a man who will not concede and who is prepared to breach all norms and boundaries as long as he can get away with it, then the question is going to be how far the American public will allow him to go, how far fellow members of his party will allow him to go. If you asked the average Republican senator or member of the House or governor or state legislator whether they would allow the president to steal the election, whether they would allow the president to use his power to keep control of his office, notwithstanding the votes of the people, they would all say no. And they would probably mean it. But if they are committed already, as they are, to a narrative of voter fraud, and if Trump says, it's not that I've been outvoted, it's that the count has been poisoned, I'm not as confident that I know how they will respond. And that's the concern that we have to guard against. And that's why every citizen needs to think about what his or her relationship is to this election, whether it's as a voter, as a poll watcher, whether their job has anything to do with securing the election. Everyone needs to be thinking about what they will do if extra constitutional means are used to try to interfere with the actual results of the election.
Well, I got up depressed this morning. Michael lighten the load a tad. And Bart, that's as grim a presentation, and I'm glad that you made it reflected in your piece. So that leaves Rachel Kleinfeld the task of navigating, and she's superbly equipped and able to do. So Rachel, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. This is quite a group to follow, and I'm going to play Goldilocks here. I'm going to fall in between Michael Steele's incredible optimism and Bart's pessimism. And it's nice to get to play Goldilocks when you work on democracies in decline and failing from corruption and violence and so on. Usually I'm in Bart's shoes, so this is good for me. So first, let's just say the election is happening. The election's happening right now. There's already been 6 million votes cast, or probably more at this point. It's been open in here in New Mexico for voting for over a week. There are long lines in Georgia. There have been opening day challenges in many, many places, but so far we are mostly muddling through. However, that doesn't mean we will continue to muddle through. And the numbers are not looking great in terms of what Americans are worried about. So More in Common, which is a group that works against polarization around the world, they found that 71% of Americans are worried about political violence in this election. That's an enormous number. A group of our best political scientists, Larry Diamond, Lee Drutman, the people doing the polling, who have been doing polling on American attitudes for years, were so concerned about the findings on violence that they actually pulled all their numbers together, all their polls together, and came out with a piece about 2 weeks ago. I think for various reasons, their numbers may be on the high side, but the numbers, even if high, discounted, are pretty alarming. About 1 in 3 Democrats and Republicans, the numbers are quite similar on both sides, feel that violence is at least somewhat justified to advance their political goals. And about 1 in 5 say that violence is a lot or a great deal justified if their side loses. How did we get to this? We're extremely, we're all on a tightrope right now. We're all worried because of the pandemic. People are highly stressed. People are at home. You see this reflected in violence figures. So in the places that had local lockdowns in March and April, you saw searches for white supremacist content rise by 21%. People don't do well when they're socially cut off, when they're isolated from their normal life, when they're seeking normal life online. And that's part of what's going on. The other part, of course, is our immense political polarization, our polarization across every area of our identity. The last part is what Bart's been talking about. We have an extraordinary president, and I don't mean that in a great way. We have a president such as we've never had before, who's priming people for fraud. And so close to 3 in 4 Americans feel that the longer we have to wait for results, the more likely it is that this is a fraudulent election. And only 4 in 10 feel that the government is committed to keeping the election secure, the federal government. And that's actually a really important point, because there are things to build on. And I'm going to get to the happy part of this at the end. The things to build on are our local and state governments, where there's much more trust and where people believe that they can do much more to affect the process, to affect their democracy. So Aaron wanted us to answer how bad this can get. And I'm actually not going to share with you how bad this can get, because a lot of my time is spent living in the nightmare scenarios that Bart sketched in his piece. It can get very bad. America has had a civil war. America has had instances of severe political violence. In the late 60s, we've had presidential assassinations. I would rather not spend my time here walking everyone through those nightmares. I think we all know those nightmares. My greatest concern, as was Bart's, I believe, is this interregnum period. This period during the process of counting just after the elections are closed. That's because there's some intense evidence that people are not going to accept that, both what I've cited already, but also just looking at the swing states. So Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, 2 major swing states, they can't even start counting their absentee ballots until after polls close. We're expecting unprecedented numbers of absentee ballots. More than the majority of ballots, more than half the ballots might be absentee ballots. You can't even start counting. It's a slow process to count. The people who are counting often, depending on state law, have to sit on those folding metal chairs. They're older. These are often 60 and 70-year-old ladies who are working the polls the way they have been for many, many years, working 18-hour days, starting to count at the evening after polls closed. In Michigan, they're not allowed to work in shifts. It has to be the same people. This is just a setup for people making mistakes and getting tired and so on, with no political fault, just because they're human beings. Michigan gave them 1 extra day. That was their big change, was suddenly they get 1 extra day to start counting these absentee votes. So we can expect there's going to be problems. One of the problems with those problems is that absentee voting is going to be extremely lopsided. Now, it shouldn't have been. I wrote a whole series of articles early in the summer with a Republican who happens to be my brother, about the importance of recognizing that Republicans can win in absentee voting, and they have in Florida and so on, that there's no reason to think of this as a partisan issue. Nevertheless, the president's proclamations throughout the summer mean that Republicans are voting in person at far higher rates, whereas Democrats have requested absentee ballots at much higher rates, especially in these swing states. So what you're likely to see is what's called a blue shift or a red mirage, where numbers that look very red on election night slowly turn blue over time. Now, a lot of people are going to see that, and they're going to be primed for fraud. They're going to say, this is evidence that things are going wrong. Meanwhile, there's over 200 lawsuits on, do you count the votes? Do you count the votes if they're not postmarked? The USPS doesn't always postmark election mail because it's not first-class mail. All sorts of lawsuits about the minutia, which might be determinative in key states. And the Democrats are going to see some of those lawsuits and say this election is being stolen. So that's the kind of thing that is going to lead to people on the streets. People turn to violence when they feel they don't have legitimate political voice, when they feel that politics, normal politics, is closed to them. And the US has muddled through for a long time. We have a very old democracy. It's mostly built on norms of forbearance, of these ideas that we don't just steal elections. But we have a history of stealing elections in this country, going back to the Reconstruction period. And countries that have histories of political violence are more at risk of future political violence. And we fall into that category. Our creaky system is mostly reliant on laws that were written right after that were written in that Reconstruction period, right after the Civil War. And they were great compromises, and they're written as great compromises. And anyone who tries to read those laws can find a lot of loopholes. And if it comes to reading those laws to determining this election, there's going to be a lot of room for different sides to have different interpretations. And there's room in the law for both of those things. I've been saying many times that we're an old democracy, but we're also a young democracy. America only really started to integrate the African-American vote in the mid-1960s. And it was a hell of a fight. That was our last big moment of major political violence. And then we turned to all sorts of techniques to try to keep that vote down again. And now that, as Bart was saying, various laws have been released and that vote can be suppressed more openly, it might be. And so we have to recognize that though we've muddled through in a way that's not the best from a democracy that should be representing all of its people. And we're at a point right now where the stakes are quite high for many people who feel that they're losing their legacy of privilege. So I'll just end with the upbeat part of this, which is that if you have a vote that is very, very decisive, we should not get to some of these nightmare scenarios. And the best way to make the vote very decisive is to vote early where you can, by absentee or in person if you can do that. Most of the problems with the vote are when the vote gets down to the line, when you're voting right near the end, when you're going late, that kind of thing. We should also keep some perspective. Violence is incredibly low right now. We're at early 1960s levels of violence, and political violence tracks criminal violence. These are very tightly related because they're very tightly related, both of them, to trust in government and in our fellow people. So we're at very low levels of violence. And even with all of the protests this summer, all of the mayhem this summer in many, many cities, the National Guard coming in, DHS troops and so on, we had very little violence this summer. And I think that's worth keeping in mind. It's nothing like when I was growing up in the 80s and early 90s. We can speak to our own sides. This violence problem is a problem of both sides, normalizing violence, and both sides are much more credible in speaking to their own sides about the gigantic body of research that says it just doesn't work. It might make you feel good. It doesn't work for anything that anyone is trying to achieve. And while both sides are justifying it, it is extremely lopsided in which leaders are justifying it. And here Republicans need to speak to their own side. There's just no way around it. The Republican leaders need to say that violence is not an acceptable way to win elections. If they don't, they're going to be a non-democratic party. And we've seen what happens in other countries when a non-democratic party exists in a democratic polity. It's not good. And the last thing is, we all just have to take a deep breath. I like Michael's favorite adult beverage. I will be drinking straight whiskey, which is my favorite adult beverage and is also probably strong enough for that night. But we just need to wait. This is not going to be an election night. It's going to be an election week, maybe 2 weeks. It's going to take a long time to count. Don't forget Al Franken took months before he was seated in his Senate race. This is not incredibly unusual. And taking a breath at that point and understanding that the count is just going to take time, and it doesn't mean anyone's stealing anything. It's actually how our process is supposed to work. Will go quite a long way to forestalling violence afterwards.
Rachel, I think you succeeded in navigating between the Scylla and Charybdis of Michael on one hand and Bart on the other. I was going to ask, as my first question, how to avoid an election season. I mean, Gore versus Bush went 36 days, 2 days, I gather, before the Electoral College convened to vote December 12th. The Supreme Court ruled. But I want to get to the issue of institutional guidelines. I mean, if you looking back over the last several years, quickly, how well do you think the executive branch under this president has been constrained? How well has the media, Congress, the courts, public opinion done in constraining? And how, Bart argues there are no adjudicators. There's really no one or no thing that we can rely on in this interregnum period that's going to help save us. But are there institutional guidelines that could actually function during this period? Congress, the courts, guidance from the Constitution, the media, public opinion? Have we nothing to fall back on in the event Bart's all too real and very grim scenarios play out? Rachel, let me begin with you, since you've looked at institutional guardrails a lot.
Sure. I mean, this is a glass half empty, glass half full kind of question. And I must say it depends on how I wake up that morning, which I'm at on any given day. I would say that America has done a remarkable job, actually, so far, constraining a leader with a fairly imperial presidency. Yes. Our presidency has grown in power over the years. Our Congress has been giving up its power for 25 years. It's really been on the back foot. Our political parties have been weakening over the years, particularly the Republican Party, I would say, has outsourced its get out the vote operation to churches. It outsourced its communications arm to talk radio and Fox. It even outsourced its funding mechanisms to these major donor groups. So it's a very weak party. It's not surprising that a populist authoritarian was able to take it over. You see that in other countries with weak parties. So given how weak our institutions have been, we've actually done a pretty good job of constraining some of the worst of what could have been. We're not doing things that we've done in the past. We haven't interred major groups of citizens within our country. We haven't removed voting rights altogether from major groups of citizens. I mean, our country has a history of doing these things. We haven't done those things under this president. So that's good. We also have some institutions that are still quite strong. So I do a lot of work with the military. Our military is really a bastion of apolitical, nonpartisan action. They do not want to be political. They do not want to be politicized. They're concerned about how this president might use them, especially given what happened this summer in Lafayette Square. Quite concerned, and I think they're going to do everything they can to make sure they are not politicized. So I think there's a lot that we can be proud of and glad of that's happened so far. On the other hand, our institutions are weaker than they used to be. And I think the weakest right now, and the one that I'm most concerned about, is the courts. Whenever you have populist authoritarians, you see them going after two institutions first. One is the DOJ or DOJ equivalent, the prosecutorial agencies. And the second is the courts. They want to weaken those things because when those entities are strong, it's the most constraining on what they can do. And what we've seen is a Republican Party that's been so desirous of power through the courts that they've been okay with going along with that weakening. And that's really concerning because we need both parties to uphold the nature of apolitical courts. That's hard in America. Our courts are particularly political in America. they're both particularly honored and particularly political. It's very unusual for other countries to have that. And right now, the level of politicization that's happening at the Supreme Court level, particularly, could destroy our courts, could destroy our ability to trust them. And then we're really up a creek. So
thanks. You know, I'm watching my phone here. It says New York Times is reporting 9 minutes ago that Virginia's online voter portal went down today, the final day to register before the election after an electronic fiber cable was severed. Interesting. Michael, let me segue to you, pick up on Rachel's point. We're watching confirmation hearings of a Supreme Court justice. There is precedent for adjudication, to use Bart's term, through the courts in an American election. How you want to share with us of any views you have on the Supreme Court's role in this, or potential role?
Yeah, the Supreme Court's role is, and I think the justices would tell you this, is a limited role. I mean, they are the last stop that you get to, not just because it's the Supreme Court, but because the way the electoral process is set up, it is designed actually to try to avoid adjudication to the Supreme Court. And folks look back at the 2000 Bush v. Gore election, and what they miss in that process was the miscalculation of the Democrats, which triggered the Supreme Court action. So the thing to keep in mind that a lot of people don't know about how we elect a president is, in that interregnum, there is a constitutional process. There is a clock that automatically kicks on. The president, the challenger to the president, the Congress, they can't stop that clock unless there is affirmative congressional action to do so. And that's just not likely to happen, whereby at a certain date, electors have to meet. At a certain date, the Congress has to confirm the decision of the electors. So there's a process. So when you go back and look at that election, what you realize is that the fundamental question that the Gore team had before them, they took door number 2 instead of door number 1. The question was door number 1, do we do a statewide recount, or door number 2, do we do a local, recount of those counties we have in question? And the choice they made was such that it automatically triggered the clock. And so understanding how the process works, and the Supreme Court had to step in at that point. They had to make a decision. Everyone said, oh, the Supreme Court weighed in favor of Bush. No, they weighed in favor of the votes that had been counted based on the process chosen by the Democrats at that time. And so the court can only go by the votes that were counted up to that point. Now, a statewide recount would have started had probably a different outcome, and the court's decision probably would have been a different one. But because of the choices that the political establishment made in a legal context, the court can't be concerned about that. The court can only go by what the Constitution requires it does in this particular moment. And I think that will be the case here as well. So as you're looking at this nomination process, the political argument that somehow Coney Barrett is going to be there to be a hammer to put Trump over the finish line, that's actually a rather bogus argument when you consider the way this process is constitutionally mandated to unfold. And so that I have less concerns about that and more faith in, to the point that Rachel made, about the process doing what it's supposed to do, the way it's supposed to do it.
Right. Let me drill down for a minute, particularly with Bart and you, Michael, on the issue of the interregnum. It's one thing not to concede and to play games with the media. It's another thing to actually have in place a full-fledged strategy to undermine the legitimacy of the election results through a series of actions, direct actions, including summoning your followers into the streets. Bart, you interviewed in your article a number of Republican officials, and Michael, you are a Republican. albeit you've obviously created a certain measure of distance from those who are Republicans today.
A slightly different brand.
Right, exactly. We'll get to that in a minute. But first to you, Bart. Is there a strategy in your view, based on your interviews? Is there an actual strategy in place?
I think there's a point that Russ Douthat, is that how you say his name?
Yeah, I actually Googled it. It's yes, it's Douthat. Douthat.
He has a point that it is hard to impute plots and strategies to this president because he is so impulsive and fixed in the moment. But he has people for that, and there are what I know from my reporting is there are discussions of contingency plans in which the Trump campaign would seek to bypass the results of popular elections state by state. In key swing states, they could call upon Republican legislatures to take back their power under Article 2 of the Constitution to decide how electors are assigned in their states. That is to say, we are accustomed to electors corresponding to the vote. But in fact, the Constitution says state legislatures can assign electors any way they like. And if he convinces his political allies that the vote has been hopelessly compromised, that no one even knows what the result is because there's been so much fraud and so much chaos that he himself has helped create, that and if the delays in the count are significant enough based on litigation and these ongoing battles, then there comes a time, and the time is December 8th, when the deadline is approaching for the Electoral College. And he asks the legislators to appoint electors who are committed to Trump. And they would say, not we're overriding the popular vote, but the popular vote can't be discerned, and we're going to have to give our best understanding of who won in our state. Now, Michael mentioned Bush v. Gore in 2000. One of the things that hardly anyone remembers about that is that on the same day that the Supreme Court handed down its decision, which was December 12th, the Florida legislature, the Florida House had already voted, and the Senate was about to vote to appoint Republican electors, even though the litigation was underway. They were going to send to the Electoral College a slate of electors committed to Bush, using their legislative power under the Constitution to make sure that that Bush got those votes. And it's not the Supreme Court decision that ended that election. It is what happened the day after, which is on December 13th, when Gore came out and conceded. Because Gore could have continued to fight in the Electoral College. And if he had done so, the forum of decision would have been a joint session of Congress overseen by the president of the Senate, who was Al Gore. And if that happens this year, the president of the Senate will be Mike Pence.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons for concern.
Right. I understand, and I agree. But Michael, is it too untethered a thought from reality to believe that Republicans, as they currently exist now, the Republican elite, it's a fantasy I have, forgive me, that a delegation of Republicans would go to the White House at some point during this period of contestation, if it was clear that the president had a determined, willful strategy to steal an election, to basically say, that's it. We will no longer support you. It's not your party anymore for any number of reasons. But is that thought simply based on the behavior of Republicans over the last 4 years? Is there no guardrail that exists among the Republican elite? Bob Woodward said last week that there are only two constraints. Now, on Trump, he cited the White House staff, which was an intriguing comment. And the second was Republicans.
Yeah, I think that there's still some validity to that, despite what we've seen in behavior from Republican leaders over the last 3 years. Certainly, there are some members in the Senate, for example, who are hypocritically sycophantic and can't be helped. There is no cure for that at this point, and nor should we try to cure them, because that's who they are. But I think by and large, what you're looking at, particularly given the impact that the president is having on down ballot elections. In January of this year, the Senate was not in play for Democrats. 3 weeks out from the election, right now, there are at least 4 seats and possibly 6 seats that are not just on the bubble, but are problematic for Republicans. And if you just want an indication of just how bad it is, Lindsey Graham is tied for his reelection seat in South Carolina. Let me repeat, South Carolina. No bastion of blue statism, South Carolina is. And if you don't believe me about South Carolina, then look at what Senator Cornyn is going through in the state of Texas. Yes, I said Texas, where the president himself is barely 1 to 3 points ahead, depending on the polls in Texas. So what you have seen over the last few weeks, and certainly in the last 3 or 4 days, is Mitch McConnell taking a much more hands-off approach to the presidential outcome of this election, and is more than aware of the senatorial impact this election could have on his leadership of the Senate and what it may mean for Republicans who want to be competitive in a Biden administration. And so I think that, yeah, there would be some degree of a voice inside the ear of the president from Republican leaders who would be saying, let it go. This is disruptive to the country. We can't afford this kind, because there is no political upside at that point. Right. Going back to Bart's points about the violence, that if that occurs, the largest group blamed for that will not be Democrats but Republicans. You can talk about Antifa all day long, but all you have to do is put up the president's own words. I want my voters to go to the polls. I want them to be disruptive. The president giving his blessing to QAnon and giving his blessing to white nationalism. That's a narrative that the people themselves have seen and heard from the president's own lips. And Republicans would be loath to sort of embrace that narrative on the other side of this election, for fear that, those seats that they can try to hold on to, they won't be able to. So that's where you see this distancing now. And the president will largely, I think, to some degree, be on his own if he tries to stoke that kind of, militant response to the election on election night.
I'll tell you one thing, if I could add to that, Aaron. There's an important guardrail, believe it or not, in Fox News. And yes, there's going to be a big question on election night and afterward. Fox News has a very professional decision desk of pollsters, political scientists, and they will know the real truth. The scenario that is most concerning, as Rachel said, is a red mirage, in which, because Trump's vote is concentrated in the in-person votes, people who say they plan to vote in person, by one poll, break almost 2 to 1 for Trump. Yep. Nationally.
It's a fascinating point.
So if we have what appears to be a Trump victory on election night, and we might not, if Biden wins Florida counts early. Right. There's not going to be any blue shift in Florida. We will know by late election night who is very likely to win Florida. If Biden wins Florida and most paths for Trump are closed at that point to victory, then you're going to see the decision desks at NBC and ABC and CBS and the Associated Press are going to be saying this election is looking very strong for Biden. It appears that he's on the verge of victory. Yeah. Will Fox go along with Trump's claims of victory nonetheless? or will it listen to its decision desk? And that's
it's a critical question.
Big difference.
Okay, the future. It's funny how many of our questions, not funny, I think it's very instructive. Back to Michael's point about aspirations and hope. Rachel, you are the prognosticator. And I'd like to turn this question to you. We have two questions to do with the future. One from Laura Dimsdale that asks, big picture, what are the three key reforms that are needed to improve American democracy going forward? Gary Officer asks a similar question on YouTube. What gives you hope with respect to the future of American democracy? I know it's a big question. We've got about 6 minutes left. Take a minute or two, if you might. It's a critically important one.
A lot gives me hope, actually. So first of all, people are engaged. A lot of people took democracy for granted for many, many years. We have about 40% of our public who doesn't vote at all. The amount of political engagement, the number of people who no longer take democracy for granted, who care about these abstract parts of election law, that's good. That's really good. And it means that we can build on that. I think there are changes that can be made, that are starting to be made, that would really be helpful. Ranked choice voting is one of the things that I talk about a lot. It sounds very wonky, but it just means that you rank your favorite people to elect as if you'd rank your favorite flavors at an ice cream shop. And Maine has voted for it. New York City's voted for it. We use it here in Santa Fe. What it means is that different flavors of political party can exist. And as Michael was saying, he has a different flavor of Republican from the man in our White House. And that's good. We need different flavors. We need a very progressive left and a working class left. We need a conservative business right, and we need a socially conservative right. These people exist in America and they deserve representation. Ranked choice voting allows them to have that representation. And it's a reform that would enable the parties, I think, to represent better while keeping some of the worst that we're seeing from rising to the top of the party solely so that everyone can pull together and win. I also see real hope in the number of good people running, particularly in the last election cycle, but also in this election cycle. You had unprecedented numbers of women coming out to run, really good candidates. We denigrate politicians in our democracy. You know, we like to say that they're all corrupt, that they're all bad, that they're all in it for themselves. Well, who else is going to run your democracy? We're actually a republic. We're not a direct democracy. We need to elect someone, and it's a really rotten job. My father used to say that if anyone tells you that you should be a senator, they're not your friend. You have to raise a lot of money. You spend a huge amount of time in a little telephone booth shaped thing, calling people and asking for dollars. You fly back and forth constantly across the country, back to your home state. It is a tough job. And then on top of it, people say that you're corrupt and rotten. Well, maybe some people are, but the number of good people who are running is really important, and starting to respect them more and recognize them for the patriots that they often can be and are is important. So a lot gives me hope, and a lot of things that we can start doing now that we care also gives me hope.
I'd raise the Electoral College, but it would require at least 2 or 3 more sessions, at least. But I think it is critically important reform. I think we've almost reached the end of our session. I want to just say something. You can call it a public service announcement. You can describe it any way you want. For most of my career, I focused on foreign policy, ignoring the domestic realities and the political culture here at home. I think leaving government in 2003, it's been 17 years now, I've come more to focus on the importance of the republic and what goes on here. And I just want to close with a quote from Lincoln, who was 28 at the time. He addressed the Young Men's Lyceum in 1838. And here's what Lincoln had to say. The foreign policy reference is important. Here's what Lincoln says at the age of 28. At what point, Lincoln says, shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all their treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, Lincoln argued at the age of 28, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free men, writing in the 19th century, of course, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I want to thank Bart, Michael, and Rachel. It's a complicated subject. You've unpacked it, you've unwinded it, and you've done so with real care, real diligence. And the future of our republic depends on people like you. Vote. Two things: vote, and please tune into the next session of Carnegie Connects. Thank you so much, Michael, Rachel, and Bart.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.